Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today, we're on day 145. We're covering Perfectere Caritatis, number 2 to 3 on basic rules for living religious life. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican or frmatthewlc.com/Vatican. Yesterday, we talked about how this document continues Lumen Gentium 6 on religious life with general norms and the variety of forms of religious life for all gifts, right? Today, we're going to talk about the need for reform that adapts to modern life while returning to the sources and focusing us on Jesus. So, we're going to start with paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 actually has lettered, numbered section, but they use letters. And so it has a text before it, and then it has A, B, C, D, and E. So it kind of matches my usual lettering of paragraphs, but these are actually like letters in the text, not just letters I add to distinguish the paragraphs. So before just saying return to the sources, point A, Jesus is the norm. Point B and C, remember the particular rule of that particular community. Point D, know the world. And point E, the spirit over apostolate or ministry. So let's read the introductory part of this paragraph, right? The adaptation and renewal of the religious life includes both the constant return to the source of all Christian life in the original spirit of the Institutes and their adaptation to the changed conditions of our time. This renewal, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and the guidance of the Church, must be advanced according to the following principles, right? So it's setting out those two things, that we need both the adaptation of the times and the source of Christian life and the spirit of the Institutes, and then we're just going to leave the rest as a bunch of rules, right? And this is important, right? We need to go back to the sources of religious life, right? Both general, like this document, Perfectere Caritatis, and particularly like the rule of specific writings. And it's not necessarily just a rule, right? For example, for my community or for a lot of others inspired somewhat by St. Ignatius, to go back and read the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, not just to read like the interpretation of the interpretation of the interpretation of it, right? Or something, right? Read the sources. As that's just one example, right? And such. And we need the situation, right? We need to talk about how does the community adapt, right? For example, in my community, all the priests pretty much have cell phones, which is something new, something different that, when I entered, a few priests, I think, then had cell phones. We were 2001, but I'm sure back in 1960, none did because cell phones didn't exist back then, right? But so that's a kind of example of how you have to adapt and things like that, right? So the first point here, A, is talking about Jesus being the norm, right? This is the central point of all religious life, right? Let's read it. A, since the ultimate norm of the religious life is the following of Christ set forth in the Gospels, let this be held by all institutes as the highest rule. This is pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? We follow Jesus, that's what all. Everything is around Jesus, right? There's many different ways to express this. In the Legion, in my own community, we talk about being Christ-centered or Christocentric sometimes. And that's ways to say, hey, we're focused on Jesus. We're looking to Jesus, right? He is the model. I didn't become a religious to it looks nice. No, I came religious to live like Jesus. This is the reason to become a religious, right? This is what we do, right? It doesn't make much sense humanly, right? Like I was doing okay in computer engineering. I could easily be making well into the 6 figures right now, right? But that is not where I felt the call. I have been called to follow Jesus. I have been called to imitate Jesus in a religious community. So let's move on to B and C about the particular rule or particular spirit of a community. B, it redounds to the good of the church that institutes have their own particular characteristics and work. Therefore, let their founder spirit and special aims they set before them, as well as their sound traditions, all of which make up the patrimony of each institute, be faithfully held in honor. C, all institutes should share in the life of the church, adapting their own and implementing in accordance with their own characteristics of the church's understanding and aims in matters biblical, liturgical, dogmatic, pastoral, ecumenical, missionary, and social. Right? So this is important, right? Each community is good, but they each have their own particular work, particular rule, particular spirit, right? And it's important to maintain. There isn't really, people think of like, oh, you can discern a vocation of religious life in general. Maybe somebody in their process is like in a mind map process thinking that way. But there's no religious life in general that doesn't exist, just like marriage in general doesn't exist. You have to be married to this person, right? I have sisters, and, I have 3 sisters, and it's very clear, some of them, that like, they would go crazy if they had married each other's spouses, right? Why? Because they're married, they discern a vocation of marriage, but with different men. In the same way with religious life, you discern it with the specific spirit, the specific one. Now, obviously, there can be a general sense, hey, I want to imitate Jesus, hey, I want to live poverty, chastity, and obedience, that can lead towards that, but that's important. And we need to look at the work of the founder, look at the spirit through the years, right? That patrimony, what we held on to, what we've carried with us, right? There's a whole debate about what is meant by patrimony. One of the priests in the Legion is currently doing his doctorate on the meaning of the word patrimony in church law and canon law, and things like that. It's very interesting, but it means that whole like history and the goodness of the church, of that community, right? The spirit and all those things. And then the church is more important than any particular community, right? We need renewal, we need to change and adapt, we need to look at the church, right? Some communities have adapted completely radically. Like, for example, there's a few communities, the Mercedarians and the Trinitarians, who were founded mainly to ransom Christian captives of Muslim slavers, right? Now, that was in the Middle Ages, that was a big thing in the Mediterranean. That's not currently a big thing, at least of European. I don't know if there's any of African Christians. That could be a case. There could be a case for reigniting that spirit, but that's what they would do, right? They don't do that now. Why? At a certain point, they realize, okay, this ministry does not really have, means and they adapted, right? And there's a lot of more subtle changes in how communities adapt to situations, right? But the important thing here is, most of all, our goal is to build up the church first, right? If I'm in the Legion, my first priority is the church. My first obedience is to what the church says, right? Obviously I'm very obedient to what my superiors say, but if my superior says, hey, go and say this heresy, I'm not going to do it. No, my obedience is first to the church. I know my superior would not say that if he's listening in, but I'm just giving an example of some order I would clearly disobey. Point D, we need to know the world. So let's read it. Institutes should promote among their members an adequate knowledge of the social conditions of the times they live in and the needs of the church. In such a way, judging current events wisely in the light of the faith and burning with apostolic zeal, they may be able to assist men more effectively. Right? We as religious should not live isolated. Some who are like hardcore camp lives, yes, if you're a Carthusian, you live very much isolated. You live a little more isolated, but you still are praying for these people, so you still at least should get some news, some awareness, so you can pray for those people more effectively, right? And as religious, you have a special vocation of the poor, the marginalized, right? And this changes with the times, right? For example, with our technological society, we have people, we have a lot of people who are the victims of abortion, the victims of, the people who are victims of human trafficking, the people who are, striving to, do better for themselves with immigration and are persecuted and things like that. And how do we help those people, right? We as religious have that poor and marginalized, but poor means different things, right? Today there are homeless people who have cell phones because you need to have a cell phone to try and apply for jobs and other things like that. And well, so if they want to try and get out of being homeless, they need a cell phone. And it seems, 20, 30 years ago, having a cell phone meant you were pretty well off, right? I remember in the 90s, it was like, in the early 90s, like the first like cell phones, not just the car phones. It was like a whole thing under the seat. It was like, ooh, that guy must be well off, right? But anyways, let's move on to our last point here. About the spirit over ministry. So let's read point E. The purpose of the religious life is to help the members follow Christ and be united to God through the profession of the evangelical counsels. It should be constantly kept in mind, therefore, that even the best adjustments made in accordance with the needs of our age will be ineffectual unless they are animated by a renewal of spirit. This must take precedence even over active ministry. Right? Again, we go back to point A. What is the purpose of religious life? The purpose of religious life is union with Jesus, imitation of Jesus, and those things, right? The purpose of religious life is not like, oh, I fed 3 people soup today or 10 people or whatever, right? Those are means to the end. There are things we do that are ends themselves, and there are things we do for the sake of others. All of religious life is for the sake of imitating Jesus, for the sake of being united with Jesus. It's not for the sake of doing ministry, right? Obviously, we do ministry as part of that, right? Jesus did ministry. We imitate him. But that importance of the priority of prayer. And that finally we need renewal, not just filling boxes, right? One of the things that was one of the dangers of religious life just before this was kind of filling boxes, not really going deep, but kind of filling the boxes. Keep Jesus, first in doing this renewal, right? This is a big point that was missed during the false spirit of renewal of Vatican II, right? That they kind of like got this, the Vatican documents say, put Jesus at the center, focus Jesus. Look at the renewal in the 20 years after Vatican II, and it's like the exact opposite of that. Like, it's like, maybe we'll have, instead of having a Eucharist communion at Mass and communion and Eucharist every day, we're going to have it like once or twice a week. How is that putting Jesus at the center? Jesus is truly substantially present in the Eucharist. We need to put him in the center. Anyways, I'm a little passionate about this, as you might have picked up on here, because I think, unfortunately, we've had a big gutting of religious life because of people who had the false spirit of Vatican II who said things completely contrary to what the documents say, and I think did a lot of damage to religious life in at least in the U.S. and Canada. I understand those cultures. I'm not going to claim to have any expertise in other cultures. I've spent basically my entire life in Canada and the U.S. I spent 3 years studying in Rome and like 2 weeks before I entered, 1 week in Rome, 1 week in London visiting. That's the only time I've been outside of Canada and the U.S. in my entire life. Oh, I guess when I was studying in Rome, I spent a few weeks in Spain too. Anyways, but let's move on to paragraph 2. It has 3 subparagraphs. We'll read them together. It's a adaptation is needed, and norms should be written to reflect the adaptation that is needed. So let's read it. A, the manner of living, praying, and working should be suitably adapted everywhere, but especially in mission territories, to the modern physical and psychological circumstances of the members, and also is required by the nature of each institute, to the necessities of the apostolate, the demands of culture, and the social and economic circumstances. B, according to the same criteria, let the manner of governing the institutes also be examined. C, therefore, let constitutions, directories, custom books, books of prayer, and ceremonies, and such like be suitably re-edited, and obsolete laws being suppressed be adapted to the decrees of the Sacred Synod. Right? So the first subparagraph here is really saying, hey, we need to adapt them to our lives, to the circumstance of time and place, especially in mission territories. What kind of changes are there psychologically, right? There are changes in different generations and how, especially in the formation, how we form people. We have to look at, to form someone, you need to look at both where they are and where they need to be. And where they are changes with the culture a little bit, right? In some ways good, some ways bad. I think there are good signs in our culture, right? That are helpful for religious people to form as religious. But there are also bad signs, right? But that's the thing of the social conditions. What are the social conditions and things like that? And even things like technology. Like I was talking about a homeless man with a cell phone, right? How do we define poverty? That's an important thing, right? And then obviously B and C just says, hey, when you govern and how you do your norms, you should adapt accordingly, right? So thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it. Another great podcast at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow we are going to continue with Perfecting Caritatis 4-5 on the need to renew religious life. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which can provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists and individual documents, and a reading plan.